From when I was born up until 4 months ago, my family of 4 lived in Nowheresville, Indiana. The town consisted of exactly 37 streets, 1 school covering kindergarten to 12th grade, 1 3-story hospital, exactly 2 pizza places, and fewer than 6,000 people. We were well off, owning a large 3-story house right next to the school, but I always got the sense that my parents were uneasy, specifically my father. He would go on month-long business trips to who knows where 3 or 4 times a year, and he always seemed the happiest a few days before leaving. At around the age of 9, I came to the conclusion that if his family wasn't here, he would be living in some metropolis at least 5 states away. He always seemed partial to New York. We'd been there a few times, and he was always more energetic than I'd ever seen him, dragging us from the Statue of Liberty to the One World Trade Center to the top of the Empire State. Then after at most a week, we would return to the land of everybody knowing everybody, and a plethora of old, white men sitting on their porches in their rocking chairs, sipping Arnold Palmers, and waving as you pass. For some people, a paradise, a retirement village if there ever was one, but for my father, purgatory. The first incident happened at exactly 2:32 a.m. I was hunkered down in my room, blanket draped over my back, illuminated by the glow of some horror movie. I can't recall precisely what it was, perhaps The Exorcist, or maybe Omen. I've loved horror movies since I was old enough to get my hands on them, and I've seen all the classics. I know the legend of Jason Voorhees, which scared me into quitting sleepaway camp. I fear the dream demon Freddy, which made me pull 2 consecutive all-nighters until I collapsed in the middle of history from pure exhaustion. Michael Myers stopped me from trick-or-treating one Halloween, and Pennywise keeps me at least 5 feet from a storm drain to this day. Yet for all their downsides, I couldn't tear my eyes away. Something about the monsters, be they human, ghost, zombie, or killer clown, always drew me back. So I was up late into the night when I heard the whistling first. It jarred me when it started, and I paused the movie for a moment before forgetting about it. It was a jaunty tune, cheerful yet erratic. It never repeated itself, and despite its upbeat nature, something about it was off-putting. Yet someone whistling, albeit late at night, was no cause for alarm. However, as the movie progressed, and I drew the covers tighter around my skinny frame, the sound persisted. After 5 minutes, I paused the movie again to listen. It was coming from the same general location, yet the direction of the sound shifted ever so slightly, as if the whistler was pacing. It couldn't have been more than 20 feet from my house, but when I checked my second-floor window, it instantly ceased. There was nothing except a spindly sapling sitting blocking my view, yet I saw no one. I sat at the window for a minute or 2, but nothing. I didn't think much of it and finished my movie, then collapsed into a nightmare-filled sleep. The next evening was much of the same. The movie playing out on the screen this time was a personal favorite of mine, Paranormal Activity, and during a quiet, tense scene about 2/3 of the way in, the clock struck 2:32, and the whistling began again. I instantly shut off the TV and grabbed my phone, clicking on its flashlight. The tune was the same, but not perfectly. Again, it never repeated itself, but it was the same pace, the same energy, the same set of notes. Something about it piqued my curiosity. I needed to know what it was. Realistically, I was sure it was only someone who couldn't sleep, waking up and whistling their tune that they came up with themselves. But something about it drew me in, something sparking my curiosity. I crept to the window, careful not to make myself visible or look out myself. I waited for what felt like eternity, but nothing changed. The tune never shifted significantly, the whistler never moved. I checked my phone repeatedly, watching the minutes go by. By the 15-minute mark, a growing sense of unease had settled in. I waited until exactly 3 in the morning, and then sprang up, scanning the area outside my window. Yet only the tree sat there, surrounded by a field of yellow-brown grass, stretching into infinity. The whistling immediately ceased, and my heart pounded in my chest. I raced to my bed, and sat against the corner, my covers around everything but my head. Phone flashlight pointed at the window and door to my room. At some point I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember is my father shaking me awake at noon. He looked mildly annoyed that I had stayed up late again, but he didn't make a big deal out of it. After I had breakfast, I settled down near him on the living room couch. Something weird happened last night. An eldritch horror forced you to stay up until sunrise. I rolled my eyes in exasperation. I heard some guy whistling outside for, like, half an hour. I immediately knew something was wrong. My father's entire body tensed up, and his eyes snapped up from his newspaper to meet mine. What? I was taken aback by the sudden shift in tone, but I continued to explain. Yeah, it was weird. I heard whistling outside my window, maybe 20 feet away. I listened for a while, but as soon as I looked out the window, it stopped. He leaned towards me. When did it start? A little past 2:30. His face had gone pale. It was the most serious I'd ever seen him, and I was terrified. I had no idea what was happening, but he continued to interrogate me. Exactly when, Thomas? How long past 2:30? 2 minutes, I think. Yeah, 2:32. Dad, what? Why are you acting like this? He paused, sat back, and slumped forward, head in his hands. I was frozen. I had no idea what this meant. Why did some whistling mean so much to him? He picked up his head and asked me a few more questions until I had relayed every detail of that night. He paused for a long moment, then got up and started to climb the stairs. Halfway up, he turned to me. Stay inside for today. I'm going somewhere with Mom. Watch Sally. The next day was Monday, and school resumed for the last time that summer. The week passed in a blur, and I said bye to all my friends who were going away to camps, which was almost all of them. Finally, on Sunday, the inevitable announcement finally arrived. We gathered around the dinner table, and the mood was already uncomfortable. Before I'd had a bite of my spaghetti and meatballs, my mother started the conversation. So, I know you guys love this town. My sister immediately interrupted. I like New York better, but your father and I had to make some financial decisions, and, well, we're moving. Somehow, I wasn't surprised. I had known for years it wasn't a matter of if, but when. My 6-year-old sister was less than pleased when she realized our destination wasn't New York, but a suburb adjacent to Boston. I quickly finished my meal and retreated to my room. Around 10 that night, I heard my parents put my sister to bed and walked down to the living room. I followed after a few minutes, and as soon as I entered the room, their quiet conversation immediately ceased. What are you guys talking about? Nothing. Honey, just the move. Bullshit. I didn't call them out on it, though, as I sat down across from them. Dad, he looked to me. Yes, is this because of the whistling? He didn't react immediately. Deep down, I knew that the answer was yes, but I waited for his response. Thomas, I promise you when you are older, I will explain everything, but I can't right now, so please, just go to bed, pack, say goodbye to your friends, whatever, but know that I'm doing this for us. He paused again, locking eyes with me. For this family. Finally, I exploded. I don't remember what I said, but it wasn't pretty. After all, at the time, it seemed to me like they were tearing my life apart because of a sound I heard a couple nights in a row. That night, I stormed upstairs in a fit of rage, eventually crying myself to sleep. I didn't hear the whistling again for a month and a half. In reality, I hadn't stayed up late enough to hear it at that time. With all the time in the world on my hands, I hadn't found a reason to stay up past midnight. After all, I had no friends in the state, much less nearby. However, my parents seemed much happier. My mother had already made some friends at some Pilates group, and my father was acting like he did in New York every day. Even my little sister had found some friends and the next door neighbors, but I spent my days in my room, dying of boredom. So in late July, I decided to try to hear the whistle again. I didn't believe I would hear it. After all, we had moved states. It would be completely illogical to think I would. And yet, when 2:32 a.m. arrived, it started again. I was frozen in fear. For some reason, I couldn't put my finger on it. But I listened. The tune was the same. It even sounded like the same distance and direction from my bedroom window as it had been in Indiana. After a few minutes, I sprang up. This time, outside my window, there was a long, dark alleyway. But still, as soon as I looked, nothing. The whistling came to a halt, and nobody was there. I didn't tell my father about the whistling. I don't know why. I wish I had. But at that moment, it felt like some little mystery for me to puzzle out. Some special secret only I had. How stupid of me. The next day, my 3 best friends paid us a surprise visit. As soon as camp had ended, their parents arranged a surprise trip to see me at request of my parents. So for the next 2 days, they would be sleeping over. I was ecstatic, and it immediately took my mind off everything else. The night passed much the same as it would back in Indiana. Horror movies, video games, and an ungodly amount of snacks. At around 1, I started to keep an eye on the clock as it inched forward. I felt as though I needed to show someone, just to prove I wasn't hallucinating, that the loneliness hadn't pushed me over the edge. I had made the decision to reveal the phenomenon to my friends. Once again, I wish I hadn't. I told them about 15 minutes ahead of time, and at first they didn't believe me. After all, we had spent the past 6 hours binging horror movies, and past midnight was the perfect time for a scary story, or a prank if you're ambitious enough. But despite their complaining, I could tell they were intrigued, and I managed to convince them to hide under the window with me. Sure enough, the whistling began right on schedule. They didn't have the patience to listen long. Josh sprang to his feet after 2 minutes, despite my repeated whispered protest, and the whistling stopped. Huh, that's odd. Why did you look? I was curious. I told you not to. So, not having enough energy to get mad over it, I surrendered, frustrated, and we resumed our nightly activities, eventually falling asleep at around 4. The next evening, my friends had a plan. David started to explain, so we just hide behind the dumpsters in the alley, then we all spring out. One of us stays in the house. If we get the whistler in between us and the window, there's no way to miss it. I pleaded with them, begging them not to, but they ignored me. I didn't even know why they were so set on catching the whistler, but they were. For some reason, I knew this was a terrible idea. I felt something deep in my stomach, screaming at me to stop them, but they wouldn't give up, finding humor in my terror, and ignoring me until I stopped trying to convince them. You always yell at the horror movies on TV, but a group of 15-year-olds can't be convinced they've had a bad idea. No one was going to be the coward that took my side. I eventually followed them out at 2:25 that night, carefully sneaking out so as not to wake my parents. I wish I hadn't. They all ducked behind the 5 dumpsters lining one side of the alley. None of us looked at our phones, or even at each other outside of quick, furtive glances. I could tell they were getting impatient, pressed up against the freezing metal backside of a full-to-the-brim dumpster with rats scurrying around nearby, despite the fact that the wait couldn't have been more than 5 minutes. I finally risked a glance at my phone. 2:31. I snapped my eyes back to the alleyway. As my heart pounded against my rib cage, the whistling started. It was working. The whistling was coming from between us and the house. I was petrified. I knew I had to stop them from jumping out. I had to get my friend at the window to look, to get it to stop, before they exposed themselves. I don't know why I felt such a strong urge to stop them, but my gut was telling me I couldn't let them look. My phone buzzed, as did theirs. We all looked down in sync. A text from our friend in the window. Jump as soon as the clock hits 2:33. I frantically texted back, telling him to look, while shaking my head wildly. I gazed pleadingly at the two with me, begging them to stop. They simply smirked and texted back, ignore Tom. Then they jumped. I shut my eyes and held my breath, my heart skipping a beat. I curled tighter into a ball, and I waited. After a few seconds of silence, I emerged from my hiding place. My friends were standing in the middle of the alley, dumbfounded. So, I asked, what? They slowly looked at me, shaking their heads. Nothing. I took that in for a second, shocked. I thought they had to be lying, but I could see in their faces that they were just as confused as I was. I paused, considering what this meant, and came to the conclusion that it meant we should get back inside as soon as possible, and I should never stay up past 2 again. Alright, you had your fun. Now can we please? Before I could finish my sentence, a shrill, ear-piercing sound tore through our ears. I snapped my hands to my ears and locked eyes with my friends, seeing them do much the same. I sprinted back into the house, my friends instantly following suit. We slammed the back door shut behind us, and after a second, it stopped. One long, angry note. What the hell was that, Tom? One of them shouted. I realized my legs were shaking, and I slid back against the wall. I don't know what you did, but can we please go to bed? We all stayed there, in shock, until Max raced down from his position at the window. Are you guys alright? What the hell was that? The next day passed in a blur until after dinner. I was sitting on the living room couch on my phone, my father taking in a newspaper on the chair opposite me. He had been acting off the whole day. I knew he could tell something was wrong, but he seemed to be purposely ignoring it, so I began to tell him what happened. By the time I reached the end of my story, he was staring at me, stone-faced, but instead of shock in his eyes, there was anger. "This isn't funny, Thomas. You don't understand what you're joking about. Now go to your room, and do not ever say something like that again." I sprang to my feet, now angry as well. "Dad, I'm not joking. Ask David or Max or Josh. They'll back me up. I swear to God, I'm not kidding." My father stood up, towering 5 inches over me, staring down into my eyes. "It's not possible, Thomas. We left that thing in Indiana. Now go to your room. Why won't you tell me what this thing is?" I retorted. "If there's some goddamn monster you know about, why won't you believe me when I say I hear it?" He paused for a moment, then returned softly, "Because when I moved to Indiana, it stayed in Washington. And when my father moved to Washington, it stayed in Montana. And you will not tell me that you have broken the chain. You will not hear the whistling again until you have a child of your own." Before I could respond, he walked briskly back to his room, shutting and locking the door behind him. I ran to catch up, hammered my fists against his door, but no response. He didn't emerge for the rest of the evening. That night, I was terrified. I tried desperately to fall asleep, but I knew I wouldn't, and sure enough, I couldn't. When the time drew near, I threw my blanket over my whole body and shoved my fingers in my ears. I'm an atheist, but that night I prayed. The whistling took a different tune for the first time. It was erratic and never repeating, but it was different in tune. Compared to its former jovial sound, it was angry, terrifying. I don't know how to describe it. It was as if all of a sudden, I had interrupted its nightly routine, and it wasn't happy. It, not him or her. Whatever this is, it isn't human. It can't be. I waited for over 10 minutes before it began to get louder. At first it was a negligible increase, nigh unnoticeable. Even after a couple minutes of it slowly getting louder, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. But after 10 more minutes, I couldn't deny it. It was getting louder, and the speed at which its volume was increasing was accelerating. It overrode every other sound I could hear, growing louder and louder until I was sure my eardrums would burst. As it crescendoed, I couldn't take it anymore. I jolted up and craned my neck, peering out the window. As per usual, it immediately stopped. At some point that night I fell into a fitful sleep, not waking up until 11 the next morning. Once again, my father ignored my pleas for help. My mother seemed worried, but she inevitably took my father's side, and they forced me back to my room. That night, I spent the next few hours coming up with a plan. I waited until 1 in the morning, when I was sure they'd be asleep, and snuck into my mother's bathroom, careful to avoid creaky floorboards and squeaking doors. I opened the medicine cabinet, and sure enough, there it was, Xanax. My mother was prescribed it some 7 years ago, and continued to use them well after her prescription ended. I scanned the back of the container, decided on 1 pill, and returned the container, carefully making my way to the kitchen. I filled a glass of water and looked at the pill. I wasn't sure if this was too much. The internet had recommended 0.5 milligram, but I couldn't continue to stay awake. I swallowed it without further thought and returned to my room. It only took about 15 minutes before the effects began to kick in. I fell asleep not long after. The whistling started right on schedule. For the first time, it jolted me awake. My heart was pounding. I felt like I should be knocked out, but I was awake. The whistling wasn't even that loud, but as I checked my phone, I realized it had awoken me right as it started. The only silver lining was that it seemed to have resumed its jovial tune, and despite the negatives of the situation, this comforted me. At first, when it began to move, my heart skipped a beat. It had shifted a bit before, but all of a sudden, it quickly shot underneath my window. I froze up, terrified. It continued to move, traveling over to where my back door is. It paused for no more than a few seconds, and then I heard the click of a lock and the door swinging open. My heart pounded wildly as I heard the whistling pass under my room to the other side of the house. It traveled up my stairs without a sound other than its jubilant tune, and I began to tense my muscles and hold my breath as it approached my closed door. It sat at the entrance to my room for over 5 minutes. I knew no one else in my family could hear it now, as it was too loud for them to possibly sleep through. My face was turned to the wall, away from the door and window, but I was ready to turn. Then my door swung open, banging against my wall. I whirled around, ready to face the monster. I wasn't sure what my plan was, but I was ready to fight whatever was coming for me. But the whistling stopped instantly, and there in my doorway was my 6-year-old sister, Sally. I said. I didn't realize how much I had tensed up, and as I relaxed, I realized my words were slightly slurred. The Xanax was still in effect, yet I was awake. Were you whistling? She looked confused. No, Tommy, I don't even know how to whistle. Then why the hell are you in here? It's like 3 in the morning. I think I left Bear in here. As I retrieved her teddy bear fur, I considered telling my parents what had happened, but the Xanax was calling me back to my bed and the whistling had stopped for the night. I would tell them the next morning, beg them to take us to a hotel or something. As Sally left the room, I collapsed back into my bed, facing the wall, and began to drift back into dreamland. I only wish I had faced the other way. What happened next chilled me to my core. Right before I slipped back into sleep, the whistling started again. It was right behind me. It was angry once again, and it was looming over me, inches from my bed. I resisted the urge to scream, curling into a ball, trembling, and sucking in shaky breaths. It moved closer by an inch, then another. It stopped there, probably touching my bed, for what felt like eternity. The terror I felt was incomparable to any I had felt before. No horror movie could prepare me for this. Then I felt pressure on my bed, as if it had moved onto it, and I rolled over, swinging my fist. I connected solidly with my bed frame, letting out an involuntary gasp of pain. I scanned my room as I shook. Nothing. Since then, I haven't moved. It's around 6, and the sun is rising as I write this, and I've been furtively scanning my room between every sentence. Tomorrow I'll make my parents do something. Take us to a hotel maybe, but just in case, I need my story out there. Wish me luck.